Mm. It's a trial balloon, it's another one of those Trump, it's just more bullshit. Just okay, we're gonna start in a second here. Okie dokie, welcome. 24th of February, 2025. It's this and that. We're going to talk about cooperative movements today. We've talked about Mondragon in Spain, and without going to a long deal about, the relative autonomy of post-war, post-Franco movements, it's there's still a sense of that, and the sense of anarchism and socialism in Spain, despite the oppression, the many decades of Francisco Franco, who is still dead. Um, Similarly, that's very instructive from an American point of view as well, is that we may have our own Francisco Franco is dead moment at some point. Now, I wanted to talk about Marxism and the cooperative movement, and there are articles on this more specifically. I came across an article, and it sort of fits my little plan here is to give you fairly current articles, well, fairly current, and it fits kind of several of the ideas that I'm fiddling around with. I included some videos. I may show that at the end. They are slightly dated. They're not as current as they should be, but they do explain Mondragon, and I know we've seen some of them before in our little group, so I'm not necessarily going to show them. You can watch them yourself. They're rather short. Rick and a video by Rick Wolf on Mondragon. But came across this article in the Journal of Management Studies from last year, and that's pretty current, with all due respect. And this is, I think, a submission version, pre-publication. But so it's an article on Mondragon. Although I excluded in my little thing here on the page the sort of history and description of how Mondragon operates, because it takes several pages and might bore you to tears, um, in the sense that it describes, how big sub firms are, and certain elements of how they kind of intra organizational issues that are actually quite fascinating and worth your reading it. I just am not going to repeat it here. I'll rehearse it here. Just simply because it you could probably get bogged down in the details. I Mondragon is always pulled out as a successful, large-scale example of cooperative organization. And this article kind of updates all of that and applies a very specific Marxian analysis, which makes it fit in with the kind of socialist aims that Mondragon does in its continuing operation, and raises the very specific issue, which I have raised before in terms of cooperative organization, and that is and it's offered in this article as five paradoxes. Um, the problem, of course, is if you have a cooperative organization, and this doesn't, besmirch the history of cooperative organizations. It's just that there's always a problem in that the institution firm, sits within an entire mode of production called capitalism, and so always there's competitive pressures, there's ideological kind of issues. And what's interesting, of course, is um, the ideological component that's really important in a cooperative firm, as it is, I think, in all collective activity, and that is solidarity. How cohesive, and there's ways to measure that if you really want to get off to some sociology, but there are cohesion issues that emerge, and I think it fits very nicely in our previous discussion of sublation and all that sort of jazz. So I like this article because it really plugs all the things together in one thing. That is cooperative movement, Mondragon, socialism, viability, and good advice. If anyone really is organizing, regardless of where you are, there's always going to be these sets of problems, contradictions, or paradoxes, and that having a dialectical perspective might clear up some of those things. Noting, of course, that management journals tend to have this, even one that does. Um, was that me or someone else? And should I disable it?
It might have been me. I don't. If you're talking about some overwrite thing,
Yeah, don't
it was
just
it was just
it's
accidental.
oh, all right, because there
Yeah.
is
I,
there's always mischief.
yeah. I didn't know. I don't know what happened. It was just yeah,
Whatever,
fumbling.
it's fine. I don't care. Although I think it does this appear on the video. Um, I don't know if you can go in and I I don't know. Can I erase this? I should be able to clear it. Well, let me. Huh, let's try and do it this way. Okay, here we are. Anyway, so aside from my yammering, let's just get started. The first thing is there's an interesting article, and that's not related to the one that I'm going to read from, but I did include the abstract. This paper has a dual aim. First, to draw attention to a number of passages in which Marx explicitly extolled the cooperative movement and thereby confute the wrong but widely held assumption that Marx was inimical to the market and rejected cooperation as a production mode, even for the transition period, that is, the transition from socialism to communism, etc. Second, to argue that the continuing neglect of Marxists, both of the cooperative movement and of the passages from Marx and Engels that present a system of producer cooperatives as a new production mode, can be traced back, in part, to the late emergence of an economic theory of producer cooperatives. Excuse me. Um, in between that, I put in a little video from Deutsche Welle on Mondragon, which is very interesting, and you can see kind of how they organize. The work is not that different. It's assembly line operation. I think the principal difference that you want to think about is that it's a work that it's collective ownership, that is property. The ownership of the means of production is distributed and democratized in that sense. So there's no class, technically, there's no class division. And it allows for various things that are of a more socialist nature. That is, if you discover that for some reason there's overproduction or underconsumption or some other reason to leave one firm, you can get a job at one of the other associated firms, probably. There's a more open idea about, more flexible idea about not being a wage slave, as it were, in that particular context. And in the history, in this article, it does describe how some firms, originally being part of Mondragon, decided to break away for a variety of perhaps scalar reasons. You have a 5,000 person firm that, for whatever, has issues, and they break away because they have some sort of sectarian or political issue. Um, but they still kind of contribute, but not under the same Mondragon kind of umbrella. So, in other words, it's not communism. It is a more socialist set of organizations, but it functions, as I've said. The issue is that you're in a large scale global mixed economy. You have other constraints. You have supply, you have a market. You always have to deal with markets. The commodity form is still there, so it's always kind of intermediate in that sense. You have to sort of look at all the constraints or variables. So this article is called "Problematizing the Cooperative Firm: A Marxian View on Paradoxes, Dialectics, and Contradictions" by Las Heras, Erasti, and Bretos. This is the abstract. It's done at, they're all, I guess, at the University of the Basque Company, or no, one is at the University of Zaragoza. Scholars are increasingly turning their attention to cooperative firms characterized by worker ownership and management as a way for organizations to address the economic, societal, and environmental problems posed by corporate capitalism. This renewed interest uh, stems from the potential of cooperatives to foster an alternative economic system grounded in democratic solidarity and environmentally conscious values. However, previous studies have not provided a comprehensive analysis of the contradictory nature of cooperatives within a broader interorganizational and systemic framework. Applying a Marxian perspective on paradoxes and dialectics, we theorize that cooperative firms operating within capitalist economies must navigate the solidarity paradox, the inherent impossibility of overcoming market competition through partial and limited solidarity strategies. Drawing on an examination of the Mondragon Cooperative Group, we illustrate how such a fundamental contradiction manifests itself into multiple paradoxes that are interwoven, mutually constituted, and inseparable. The article contributes to critical management scholarship on cooperatives by offering a deeper understanding of how these organizations perpetuate systemic capitalist patterns. It also contributes to paradox and dialectic scholarship by theorizing that paradoxes are not timeless and universal, but the result of persistent contradictions inherent to historically contingent organizational forms. Now that all sounds like business speak aside from being Marxist. And so, you have to sort of take that with its usual academic grain of salt in this particular article, but it's a worthy article, I think. It's precise, it identifies all the issues, has no math. It's all those things I think that make it a reasonable little read. The concept of a paradox, of course, is generally problematic in the 21st century. Was it Peter Stedlich refers to paradoxes in a and not unlike the idea of, I think he refers to them as enlightened false consciousness, which is kind of contradictory, but also dialectical. So it's sort of an interesting idea. The quote here is that two souls, alas, dwell within his breast. The one is ever parting from the other. And, in some ways, that's sort of describing sublation in one way or another. It's a quote from Marx's Capital. We draw on Marxian categories and methodology, as well as recent contributions from paradox and dialectics theories, to argue that the organizational boundaries of the cooperative firm impose their own limits on systemic societal transformation. This is because cooperatives encounter what we coin the solidarity paradox. They face the necessity to compete through partial and limited forms of solidarity in order to ensure organizational sustainability. Thus, cooperatives navigate the strategic paradox of having to improve member and community living standards while simultaneously keeping up with market labor productivity standards and capital accumulation rates to remain profitable. drawing on a critical examination of Mondragon, a group of member-owned and managed cooperatives that is often celebrated as the most successful and influential cooperative experience in the world. We illustrate how such a fundamental tension manifests itself in 5 paradoxes that are interwoven, mutually constituted, and inseparable. Overall, this article makes 2 broad contributions. First, by applying a Marxian view of dialectics and paradoxes to cooperative firms, we provide a unified framework to assess their transformational potential, moving beyond one-sided analyses that focus solely on internal solidarity patterns. So they, list those articles, or broader contextual factors. This approach reveals how Schweikert's a big deal in the field. This approach reveals how organizational contradictions and values, though seemingly separate, are actually interdependent, highlighting that the cooperative structure itself impedes systemic transformation. Second, we contribute to paradox scholarship by demonstrating that dialectics is not a medium-range theory, quote unquote, but an open method of critique. Our Marxian analysis suggests that paradoxes are not universal or timeless, as many paradox scholars argue, but are instead relatively stable symptoms of contradictions inherent in historically contingent organizational forms, making them open to sublation or transcendence. Aufhebung. The remainder of the article is organized as follows. First, we review the theoretical and methodological foundations of paradox and dialectics theories and outline several shortcomings inherent in paradox scholars' understanding of contradictions and dialectics. Second, we build a Marxian critique of the cooperative firm by first explaining how commodity production makes them reproduce a particular organizational paradox, to later unfold a dynamic setting in which cooperatives are driven by market competition, the thrust for capital accumulation, and sources of class struggle. Third, we illustrate the theoretical framework by analyzing the solidarity paradox through a multidimensional, multi-level, and interorganizational critique of Mondragon. The final section summarizes the main theoretical contributions, proposes several avenues for further research, and concludes with important implications for management research. So you can see this is the usual shtick for business academia. So it's a little, it's kind of heavy on the organizational stuff, which makes it ostensibly business sociology. But anyway, that's kind of what's going on here. Theoretical and methodological remarks on paradox and dialectics. Scholarly literature on paradox and dialectics has gained growing relevance across a wide range of management subfields, such as strategic management, leadership, international business, and human resource management. Despite the multiple origins of paradox and dialectics approaches, they all emphasize the role of contradiction as a principle of organizational change instead of, quote, linear rational binaries. Putnam. Although the theoretical and methodological similarities and differences between these two approaches remain fuzzy, recent attempts have been made to compare and integrate them. Our Marxian approach aims to bring several new insights into this vibrant and polyphonic debate. Paradoxes have been defined as contradictory yet interrelated elements that exist simultaneously and persist over time. As a meta-theory, paradox scholars define several general principles that may be applied to multiple theories, but above all, they emphasize the ontological principle of contradiction, or unity of opposites, as constitutive of organizational reality. Paradox scholarship has often been used as a problem-solving research strategy, the appropriate response to persistent contradictions being to quote unquote cope with seemingly incompatible demands. For example, logical in isolation yet contradictory when juxtaposed in order to achieve peak performance and long-term organizational sustainability. Accordingly, paradox scholars have highlighted the organizational dualities between stability and change, exploration and exploitation, competition and cooperation, control and collaboration, rationality and intuition, and discourse and materiality, among others. Similarly, An important body of research has emphasized the irreconcilable tensions faced by hybrid organizations when they combine multiple and often conflicting strategic missions at their very core. These include a variety of organizations that operate according to commercial requirements while simultaneously pursuing alternative goals such as the labor market integration of disadvantaged people and work integration social enterprise, like DEI, right? The empowerment of local producers from the global south in fair trade organizations, the provision of financial services to poor people in microfinance organizations, and the promotion of economic democracy and worker cooperatives. Within paradox scholarship, dialectics has been frequently presented as a subdivision of the overall framework, particularly in relation to the classical thesis-antithesis struggle for recognition. In this view, the struggle involves seeking absolute power over the opposing pole, with the synthesis emerging as the result of one pole dominating the other. Thus, dialectics is viewed as a mid-range method, as well as the abrupt nonlinear moment within a learning spiral and organizational transformation. Therefore, the popular view perceives paradoxes as persistent, inherent contradictions to which a definitive response is impossible and yet indispensable, hence the paradox. In contrast, dialectics refers to specific contradictions that are contingent and surmountable and etc. However, we consider this definition of organizational contradictions and paradoxes, where dialectics is subordinated to paradox due to the perception of it being less persistent, to be problematic. It may reflect a defensive mindset, quote unquote, that resists reconsidering the foundations of paradox theory while undervaluing the critical and explanatory potential of the dialectical method. We agree with authors who have questioned whether what is often labeled a paradox may actually be an optimization problem, a merely interpretive dispute, or an ideological tactic to reify particular paradoxes in order to preserve a status quo. There are three further methodological problems worth highlighting with the above dominant conceptions of contradictions, paradoxes, and dialectics. First, paradox scholars have simplistically defined dialectics through the classical triad of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But for Hegel and Marx, dialectics has no systematic method or enclosed way of thinking. In fact, Marx and Hegel actually predicate the opposite, that the correct scientific method is to scrutinize categories, if we're engaging in philosophical analysis, and historically determined relations, if we are performing materialist analysis, without bringing unjustified assumptions or external elements into the thought process. Hence, dialectics and critical thinking are not about imposing an abstract triad, but about the manner in which the thinking process develops and demands to be thought when we guard against the assumptions that are hidden in what appear to be the simplest and the most innocent questions. Second, the organizational paradox and dialectics literature has understood contradiction as the simultaneous presence of two essential elements that are connected or interrelated, yet directly opposed. From this perspective, contradiction is about addressing the interdependence between two essential elements that can exist independently, that is, the good and the bad, logical in isolation, but absurd or irrational when juxtaposed, not unlike my stuff. This is particularly evident in the literature on hybrid organizations, which is generally considered the interplay between conflicting goals as a trade-off, where advancing one often requires compromising the other. However, our Marxian view on contradictions is about recognizing the necessity to grasp the identity in difference. Identity in difference. That the full realization of one element cannot take place until it incorporates the determinations of another that was initially positioned in opposition. That you can see that operative in negation versus negation, right? Things come into being, that's the ontological part, things come into being through their opposite because they are partial and limited when understood in isolation from the reality that they emerge from. In other words, what is dialectical is not only the method, but reality itself. Therefore, the ontological principle of contradiction is not about how two separate or distinct elements form a new element, for example, an unjustified rather than organic or determined unity of opposites, but about showing how every real form realizes its qualitative determination by transforming itself into a more concrete form because the process of determination is a process of becoming another. For example, a movement of self mediation. In short, contradiction is not about two distinct things abstractly put together to make a new one. Rather, it was already one thing with contradictory forces within it, one thing against itself, revealing its inherent potential to transform into something else through its opposite. This implies that the meaning we originally ascribed to something is expanded and transformed through its opposite. For example, solidarity can become calculating and competitive, and it often does. It's kind of why all these political groups break up. As Todd McGowan states, there is a danger in thinking of contradiction simply as difference, because difference creates the illusion of the possibility of harmonious coexistence. But contradiction, in contrast, reveals that no entity can ever harmoniously coexist with itself, separate from the rest. Dialectics, then, is the research method that recognizes the contradictory nature of reality, that is, the impossibility of self identity. A dialectical approach to contradictions and paradoxes points to the openness of reality and advocates for a strong processual, historical, and self critical methodology that is largely absent in paradox studies for, etc. The second lesson enables us to understand how cooperatives, finally, are simultaneously competitive and solidaristic organizations. They cannot be one thing without the other, in contrast to non-dialectical conceptions that perceive these two organizational values as distinct rather than as different sides of the same coin. The identity in difference of a specific organizational form. Third, the examination of organizational complexity through paradox lenses has generated studies in which the relation between distinct and multiple contradictions and paradoxes is undetermined, imprecise, or even ad hoc. Indeed, recent calls from paradox scholars urge us to view paradoxes as interconnected and nested across time and space, as well as to scrutinize how fundamental or underlying contradictions and paradoxes can give rise to additional ones. However, and although a wealth of organizational studies recognize the existence of ambiguous and contradictory forces within cooperatives and other hybrid organizations, these studies have not engaged in systematically explaining how the tensions inherent in a specific organizational form can be expressed in different, more developed and complex ways. This highlights the importance of showing how multiple contradictions and paradoxes develop from a foundational one, as illustrated by the solidarity paradox here examined. In summary, dialectics challenges appearances by grounding them in broader historical processes and exploring why they appear in such a form. This inverts the ontological prioritization of paradoxes over contradictions. From Marxian perspectives, paradoxes emerge when contradictions appear to be fixed in time, governing particular forms of organizational life, and may disappear or mutate when substantial transformations occur. Now, you could argue that DEI is one of those things, or this anti-wokeism is a version of that. In this sense, dialectics involves recognizing how organizational tensions are historically and politically addressed and demonstrating that certain contradictions may become paradoxes when organizational forms become reified or naturalized. That's the current resistance to this. The paradox then represents the practical and ideological form in which the particular contradiction appears to organizational actors and researchers as insurmountable. Nevertheless, Paradoxes are real because social actors are unable to reflect on themselves and collectively transform the transitory, partial, and limited nature of the relations and organizations they've created. In this sense, dialectics is an encompassing and open methodology that incorporates paradoxes within its toolbox, impelling us to question why paradoxes become fixations of an inherently open and disruptive reality. Moreover, as the case of Mondragon will demonstrate, a simple contradiction inherent to a particular organizational form manifests in multiple and different paradoxes. This implies the possibility of addressing complexity without relying on under-theorized descriptions that present paradoxes as distinct and separate, rather than as the concrete manifestation of a primary contradiction. That is, paradoxes emerge and unfold through complexity. There's a whole, discourse on complexity stuff, and this is an example of that. Next section, commodity production, the cooperative firm, and the solidarity paradox. According to Marx, capitalism is a social order in which wealth is expressed in the form of, quote unquote, an immense collection of commodities. While commodity production and markets have existed in other social orders, Marx explains how it's possible that the product of human labor generally takes the social form of a commodity. In any complex society, there's implicitly a social division of labor in the diverse totality of useful labor activities, but their products need not necessarily appear as commodities. And I'm quoting Heinrich. Human labor has always had a social character, but only the products of mutually independent acts of labor performed in isolation, for example, independently and privately, can confront each other as commodities. Hence, it is not the separation of tasks that leads to commodity production. Rather, it is the social structure underlying the division of labor that reveals the social nature of work. That's how its necessity occurs. Building on the first methodological lesson from the previous section, a dialectical analysis of the cooperative firm must examine its emergence within its social context. At the simplest concrete level, we can think of an establishment of a cooperative occurring when at least two workers combine their labors freely and independently from direct relations of dominance to mutually engender the coordinated production of commodities. Regardless of the motives for the constitution of the cooperative, for example, political, financial, ethical, its workers freely agree to organize their labors collectively through a direct relationship of solidarity that bonds them legally into the production of commodities. These independent cooperative workers agree to bestow on each other the right to control their respective individual labor processes. Therefore, when cooperative workers establish a cooperative, they enter into a legal contract as equals, agreeing to be part of a particular political relationship which their labors are organized directly through solidarity rather than indirectly through the impersonal market. These workers extend their individual freedom by sharing democratic control over their laboring capacities through a determinate institution, that is, the assembly of cooperative workers, the council in that sense, This breeds a cooperative division of labor that utopian scholars conceive to be radically distinct from traditional capitalist firms. Now, there are two reasons for this. First, the workers have freely and independently entered into a democratic and solidaristic association that secures their right to intervene in the organization of their labor processes. And second, they retain the right to a share of the produce and potential surplus, circumventing the exploitative relationship between the capitalist and the wage worker, wage laborer. Therefore, utopian scholars assume wage labor and class exploitation as the fundamental relations of capitalism rather than commodity production. As a result, they portray the cooperative firm as a radical alternative because it's both democratic and devoid of exploitation. As David Schweikart argues, using the market to allocate goods and services does not make a society capitalist. Market competition is not the antithesis of socialism, as we often see in the news. What makes a society capitalist is that the capitalist classes derive their wealth from their ownership of productive wealth, that is, from capital. So that's the whole argument for capital in that sense. These analyses, however, fail to link the emergence of cooperatives to the market relations that mediate their reproduction, thereby normalizing the systemic contradictions inherent in them. In this context, cooperative workers cannot plan or consciously organize the distribution of their products to meet social needs, because since it's only after, not before, market exchange occurs that their private and independent labors are recognized socially. That is, as Marx says, in the midst of the accidental and ever fluctuating exchange relations between products. Therefore, while cooperative workers claim that their labors are organized according to solidarity values, such solidarity does not extend to other commodity producers. In fact, the organization of the societal reproduction in a market economy populated by cooperatives gives cooperative workers direct collective control over the content of their product, that is, the labor process, but simultaneously leaves them powerless with respect to the social form it takes, i.e., market competition. Thus, even if all workers were in cooperatives, labor could not be considered fully cooperative to the extent that each individual co-op would be in market competition with other co-ops and their workers. Here, a primary contradiction emerges, not from arbitrarily juxtaposing two opposite values, but because both are intrinsic to the organization itself. The uncertainty of whether their collective labor will meet a social need makes waste a potential outcome, along with more extreme consequences such as unemployment, competition for survival, inequality, poverty, material fallout from economic crises. Hence, wasteful market competition and economic crises were already present as a social necessity when laborers maintained their one-sided solidarity through market interaction. This made it a matter of chance whether their commodities would be sold or not. The development of a solidaristic organization depends on market success for its survival raises an important strategic question. How much solidarity can cooperative workers express directly with their coworkers and indirectly with the rest of society when the product of their labors confronts them as an external power, specifically the necessity of the commodity to be sold in a competitive market? Should they expand their solidarity to include the rest of commodity producers, or should they instead break their political bonds in order to survive as a private and independent group of individuals? The strategic question of how solidaristic or militant cooperative workers may choose to be arises from the cooperative firm being simultaneously built upon solidaristic and competitive forces that together produce a contradictory unity. The reproduction of such a contradictory unity takes the form of a solidarity paradox, both objectively and in the eyes of its membership. It's a solidarity that governs the labor process in order to engage with other social actors competitively through market interaction. The solidarity paradox represents an ongoing strategic contradiction for the cooperative worker, being solidary with their peers over the direct control of their labor process and being equally opposed to the rest of commodity producers through a relation of competition. In other words, the paradoxical consciousness of the cooperative worker becomes the necessary reified consciousness that preserves its collective estrangement from all other commodity producers, a faithful act of solidarity which seeks social unity in the impersonal and disorganized market. In this sense, it is precisely by clinging to this very self-generated, absurd, or irrational strategic situation that cooperative workers do not oppose capitalist relations, but instead reproduce them in a specific way. That is, by becoming a community of commodity producers who, at one and the same time, sell commodities in the market through a calculated form of solidarity. In other words, identifying yourself, membership in a co-op, blah, blah, blah. Methodologically, dialectics has allowed us to tie what were initially conceived as self-determining, logical, ethical values to a historically determined concrete praxis, that is, of commodity production. Instead of concrete elements being logical sort of in themselves, but paradoxical when juxtaposed or interrelated, dialectics demonstrates how contradictory organizational values, such as solidarity, reveal their paradoxical nature when put into practice. This reveals that these values might also embody their opposite, thus becoming self-undermining due to the environment in which they're reproduced. This underlines how the transformational strategy inherent in the organizational form of the cooperative is flawed from the outset. An organization of mutualized labors that systematically reproduces competitive relations with other social actors. Consequently, the persistent contradiction underlying this solidarity strategy appears in the form of a paradox. Capital accumulation, next section, accumulation and class struggle in the cooperative firm. Before undertaking a Marxian analysis of Mondragon, it is essential to first explore market dynamics in greater depth. A market society presupposes money to be the universal commodity and prices the quantitative relation between any commodity and money. Interestingly, once money historically emerged as the general standard of value, the pursuit of an abstract infinite, that is, the endless accumulation of money, became a possibility too. Under capitalism, the simple reproductive economic cycle, CMC, selling in order to buy commodity, money commodity, where money serves merely as a medium for the exchange of commodity, is inverted. It transforms, that is, CMC becomes MCM, and this is how the cycle works, where money becomes the means for buying in order to sell at a greater price. Behind these two distinct forms of circulation, a difference of content lies hidden. In the case of the simple circulation, the content of the process is given by satisfaction of needs, that is, by individual consumption. In the other case, on the contrary, the extremes must be distinguished from each other in order for the circuit to acquire a purpose. Thus, the adequate form of this second process of circulation must necessarily be M-C-M prime, where the initial sum of money produces through its movement a larger amount of value, that is, a surplus value. Money, which circulates according to this form, becomes determined as capital. So this is how capital gets produced. It's CMC to MCM and back again. As a result of the incessant movement of commodities and of money yielding more money, the endless valorization of value or capital comes into being as an impersonal form of power. And here they're quoting Soren Mao, who will look at Soren Mao again. Marx explains in detail how this surplus value originates in the labor process and not in market exchange. It cannot be in the latter, that is, market exchange, because that would violate the law of value in which commodities are exchanged at their value or competitive price. In the capitalist enterprise, governed by the capitalist division of labor, surplus value emerges when workers are hired and put to work. Consumed, that is, they're consumed productively, with the purpose of accumulating and expanding capital unlimitedly. This drive to accumulate impels companies to compete with each other in the market for higher profits. In turn, competition forces them to revolutionize the technical conditions of social production and constantly increase productivity in order to survive, as we looked yesterday at relative versus absolute surplus value. In this way, workers are subsumed to capital and its impetus for accumulation through the everlasting expansion of their productive capacities through renewed forms of exploitation. However, things are not that simple under the cooperative division of labor, where there's no formal distinction between capitalists and workers, although see Mondragon's employment strategies below. In this case, cooperative workers personify both the bearers of money as capital, that, for example, the capitalists, and of labor power, i.e., the wage workers. The pursuit of the economic process with the goal of providing decent wages presupposes their democratically run organization being mediated by the market. Consequently, their social bonding with each other enterprises is shaped by competitive dynamics, such as the possibility of being financially outperformed by those with whom they share no solidarity ties. It is true that the original motive of cooperative workers might not be to maximize returns on their investments, but it is also true that the necessity to socialize their produce through market exchange implies cooperatives operating under the law of value and being exposed to the outcomes of anarchic market exchange, that is, waste, unemployment, and inequality. In turn, economic calculation, that is, determining the economic sustainability of their solidarity strategy, necessarily takes the form of differentiating between production costs, that is, fixed and variable costs, including wages, and profit. This is a necessary accounting practice that reflects the paradoxical consciousness of the cooperative worker as a bicephalous producer of commodities that personifies the mutually negating interests of capital and labor power. Now, before addressing its politically conflictive nature, let us first explain how this accounting necessity mediates cooperative management. On the one hand, if cooperative firms fail to distinguish production costs from surpluses or profit, they may allow higher rates of self-exploitation than competitors with whom they could potentially collaborate, work with, or work for. Additionally, this failure could result in the uncontrolled depreciation and devalorization of their original investments, jeopardizing their organizational sustainability. It would also limit their ability to make inter-organizational financial comparisons, which are crucial for redirecting resources to more socially useful or profitable projects. Thus, if cooperatives do not consider the possibility of making profits or losses, even market production costs, they lose the ability to assess whether their collective efforts are both socially useful and economically sustainable. On the other hand, such an economistic mindset enables cooperative workers to simultaneously deploy various solidarity strategies that typical capitalist firms do not adopt. Aiming at yielding the highest rate of profit is a potentiality of the cooperative firm, but not a necessity. Although this is also true for capitalist firms. For example, cooperatives may well organize the labor process in a less exploitative way than typical capitalist firms because surplus value is directly appropriated by the cooperative workers, and their relatively lower productivity rates and higher wages can be counterbalanced by lower profit rates. Conversely, if a cooperative is operating at an average or higher rates of productivity and profit, the cooperative workers may opt for establishing new direct solidarity ties by redirecting their surpluses to incorporate new workers or to the provision of social welfare, child care, for example, instead of accumulating them individually, collectively, as dividends or capital investments. More specifically, these expanding solidarity strategies can take the form of 1. Redistributing profits to socially useful projects and welfare. Number 2, lowering selling prices as a form of direct subsidy to the customers. And 3, reorganizing the labor process and generating new solidaristic employment despite perhaps operating below average productivity rates. Therefore, in a dynamic setting, the original solidarity paradox assumes a more developed form in that cooperative workers have to choose between two apparently opposite strategies: expanding their solidarity through monetary wealth redistribution, or organizational incorporation, or reconfiguring their resources in order to augment their productive capacities and preserve their financial sustainability vis-a-vis external competitors. The solidarity strategies of cooperative workers are constantly challenged by the impersonal antagonistic market forces, which evaluate the effectiveness of their collective, solidaristic, yet private and independent labors. If competitors use their surpluses to boost labor productivity, cooperative workers must do the same to avoid being pushed out of the market. The unlimited reconfiguration and expansion of the productive capacities of the cooperative firm is how cooperative workers experience their real subsumption to capital and the effective loss of their collective autonomy. If it were only a formality, a matter of property relations, then cooperatives would genuinely embody the real potential to escape such market pressures and establish a free community of laborers that exchange without being subordinated to the laws of capital accumulation. However, the necessity to engage in market exchange in order to reproduce their organizational form, no matter how democratically and mutually governed they might be, reveals that markets have a real effect on the management of the cooperative itself. The compulsion to accumulate is not merely a wrong moral principle, but it structurally conforms solidarity strategies, which, in order to be reproducible, must prove to be competitive. Now, I've reached close to the end of my time, and there's, I think, a bunch more, and this is going to take another 30 minutes probably. There are concluding remarks, and maybe I'll just do this tomorrow. Anyway, the point is, what I want to suggest, and I think the article is very good for that, is to show that there are issues. There are certain things that seem paradoxical and that are generally a challenge and a problem for cooperative organization. Is there lower productivity? People are not compelled to, achieve a certain kind of competitive market conditions, and that's kind of a problematic element. And that can be even more problematic in terms of a larger scale market. But I think it's important to remember that it's still possible to organize this way and survive. And I think Mondragon is a good example of that they managed to sustain themselves within a much larger community sort of organization, and of course a responsible regional government and state governance and et cetera, et cetera. So all of those things weigh on the side of Mondragon. Anyway, it's simple that they are identifying this problematic productive set of paradoxes. That on the one hand, you politically or ideologically feel a greater solidarity with your fellow workers, and it's more horizontal than vertical in terms of management, and there are shared benefits and invested kind of connection and continuity, solidarity with the company itself. And if one has a reasonable ideological outlook, it's not so much solidarity with the company as a kind of cult-like entity, but rather simply that, people are in a collective activity that share, things and reorganize work in less oppressive ways. In other words, a 4-day work week, or, options for, taking time off and et cetera, et cetera. And Europe generally, because of unions, trade unions have generally reduced it, these kinds of things, a 30-hour week or a 35-hour week, as opposed to the, so-called American 40-hour week. Although, of course, the way American capitalists get around that, of course, is that not only certain types of people get 40-hour work weeks, and they try and force people into 30-hour work weeks in order to avoid paying benefits, for example. And still, as I've always said, it's still about the pay stuff. So that's the extent of my yammering for today. I may try and finish that off or by something else. Let's see. There goes the neighborhood. Anti-wokeism. All righty. Let me shut this off and stop share.